You're listening to EduVoices, Champion Foster Futures, a podcast amplifying the voices of those transforming education for children in foster care. Each episode brings you real stories, research, and advocacy efforts to improve the lives of foster youth. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Now, let's dive in.
Welcome to EduVoices, Championing Foster Futures, a podcast dedicated to elevating conversations that matter for children, youth, families, and the systems that support them. I'm Dr. Stephanie Barbary.
And I'm Dr. Dusty Palmer. We're glad you're joining us for this special three-part series recorded with leaders from Texas CASA.
In this series, we explore foster care from multiple angles: leadership, family engagement, program support, and policy, to better understand how advocacy and collaboration can strengthen outcomes for foster-connected youth.
Each episode stands on its own, but together they offer a broader look at the people, practices, and policies shaping support across Texas.
In this final episode, we're joined by Stephanie Battaglia and Anna O'Quinn from Texas CASA.
Together, they work at the forefront of policy and advocacy, helping shape legislation and systems that impact foster-connected youth across Texas.
Their work helps translate policy into practice and ultimately into better outcomes for children and families. Now let's begin. So what are the current legislative priorities for Texas CASA, and how do they reflect the needs of foster-connected youth in Texas?
Yeah, so just to kind of preface that question, if anyone isn't familiar, Texas is one of the few states in the country that operates on a biennial legislative structure, which means instead of meeting every year, get a nice break from each other and we meet every other year. And so we're currently in a legislative interim since our legislature meets in odd-numbered years. And so our policy team is actually currently making our legislative priorities for the next session starting in January right now. And the way that we make our policy priorities is we do a lot of work with connecting with our local CASA programs. In the state of Texas, there are 74 local CASA programs that serve 217 out of the 254 counties in the state of Texas. And we really like to make sure that our policy priorities and any legislation that we're working on is really rooted in local lived experience, the lived experience of CASA staff, CASA volunteers, and the children and families that they serve, because at the end of the day, policies are going to be based on real stories that are happening in communities. But on top of that, we also work to support legislation with our priorities that not only supports the children and families that CASA serves, but children and families throughout the entire state of Texas. I know we'll talk a little bit later about how we support legislation that doesn't even cover kids in foster care, because supporting kids is always at the end of the day going to be our mission and vision. And then lastly, we also work a lot on finance and budgeting. Texas CASA is state funded through the Health and Human Services Commission, so we do a lot of work with the budget. But I would anticipate that our legislative priorities are going to be pretty broad, supporting kinship families in the state of Texas, safe and stable placements, and older youth and care.
I mean, right off the bat, it already resonates to me from the first episode with Vicky of how, yes, this is Texas CASA, but it's for all kids. Mm-hmm. Even if they don't have a case specifically for a CASA child, it's already saying that we're going to advocate for all foster kids. And so that's very important. How does policy directly influence the day-to-day experiences of children in foster care?
Yeah, policy, it really impacts a lot of it. And a lot of what our policy team does is having to educate our local programs on how much that policy really does impact them. So for example, this last session, I worked on a bill, House Bill 694, that kind of changed the Notice of Significant Event statute timeline for parents who have kids in care, and that notification of significant events. So a significant event would be medication change, placement change, a big educational decision. And before, parents had to be notified within 48 hours. But if I have a kiddo and my kid is placed in Houston and then is moved to Amarillo overnight, I'd want to know about that immediately. And so that was a really huge bill that was passed that really impacted the day-to-day experience of not just children in foster care, but their parents and their families who are wanting to stay connected as they're in care. So something that Texas CASA does is collaborative family engagement. That's something that we keep really rooted in our policy advocacy at the Capitol as well. In addition to what we do in local engagement efforts around the state is making sure that kids and families remain connected during their time in care. Policy is a really huge part of that, of not just the programs and services that kids and families rely on, but the funding that comes with it. And so not only are we working on legislation, we're advocating to make sure that parents, kinship caregivers, foster parents, placements are getting the funding they need to be able to offer services and supports to kids. We're constantly trying to work to kind of build up more capacity in rural communities, especially. I know that's something that's talked about very often. It's definitely something that the Texas Tech community can resonate with up in the Panhandle. Something that is also a huge priority for us is making sure that regardless of what part of the state that you're in, you're getting that same level of care and service, because that's the bare minimum of what these kids deserve.
Certainly. So many of our listeners may not be familiar with how advocacy works in the legislative process. So can you walk us through how Texas CASA engages in that legislative process and advocates for policy change at the state level?
Absolutely. So Stephanie did a good job explaining how the legislature meets biannually, which just means every 2 years. Texas is unique in that way. We always like to say, though, the work for the future session starts at the last day of the previous session. So we're doing work all around the clock to make sure we're advocating for kids and families. And we do this in multiple ways. One thing that's really impressive about Texas CASA is they're actually engaging in all three branches of government. So not only the legislative process, which is what you're thinking of passing bills, we're also working in the judicial branch. A really good example I like to give is that we do work with the Texas Children's Commission, which is actually established by the Supreme Court of Texas to bring stakeholders together. So I just like to highlight that we're not just doing work at the Capitol with passing bills, with advocating for bills, but we're also doing work in these other branches of government. We also are partnering really closely with state agencies like the Department of Family Protective Services, DFPS, and then you heard Stephanie mention HHSC, Health and Human Services Commission. So we work really closely with them to talk about how to implement this legislation in a way that will actually support kids. So our Texas CASA and our public policy team, we really do the groundwork of the work at the Capitol. But like Stephanie highlighted, we're really relying on local programs to do that grassroots advocacy, to talk about what is lived experience, what is really happening on the ground with these kids. So a great example, we're traveling around right now actually to local programs and telling them, here's how you frame your story in a way that's going to resonate with the legislator, really help them understand what's actually happening. Because you know how to tell your story. You have wonderful stories of working with kids, but how do we frame it in a way that's going to make sense to a legislator in their ears specifically? So that's one thing we do. We also work with local legislative advocacy teams. We love an acronym in the child welfare world, so we call those LATs. And we have 57 LATs across the state, and those are volunteers and staff members in these local programs that specifically have signed up to engage in our grassroots advocacy work. So that's how we partner with them. We also are doing just work at the Capitol. So this is anything from meeting with the legislator one-on-one, telling them about a bill that we really support and we encourage. It also means testifying in committee, which is when legislators are meeting on specific topics to get bills moved. Sometimes we'll visit every single office on the House side or the Senate side if there's a bill that we really need to make sure passes and is pushed through. I always like to say the legislative process is actually created to not pass bills than to pass bills. So for an example, last session, there's 8,700 bills filed. Only 14% of those passed. So a lot of our work is actually telling legislators what needs to be moved to the forefront, what needs to be passed quickly. Often it's not because legislators are against bills, they just don't know what to prioritize. So we're taking experiences from local programs and saying, hey, in the child welfare space, here's what we really recommend you prioritize that needs to be fixed right now for the next 2 years, right? This is also very collaborative. So we're not the only agency doing child welfare advocacy at the Capitol. We're really unique in the way that we partner with local programs, but we really rely on a lot of our collaborators. So a really great example of this is there's a group called the Child Protection Roundtable. Texas CASA is the vice chair of that group, and it's actually a coalition of over 80 child welfare advocacy organizations. So I like to give a highlight of that. And then Stephanie is going to tell us about one of our main events that happens every session.
Yeah, so something that I always tell local programs and our legislative advocacy teams when we're talking about the importance of grassroots advocacy is really emphasizing their strength as a constituent and emphasizing that at the end of the day, they're an expert in what's happening in their legislators' districts. And so a great opportunity for our local CASA programs to engage at the Capitol during a legislative session is our big advocacy day called CASA Day at the Capitol. Last session, we had a really successful day. We had just over 160 legislative visits in one day and just over 280 attendees from local programs across the state. That's a really huge opportunity for the CASA network, is what we call our local CASA programs. They all come together and advocate for our policy priorities. We had a huge funding ask last session that we were able to get added to the budget. And a lot of that was thanks to the grassroots advocacy work that our local programs do, because legislators really care what they have to say, because those are the people that are doing the actual work in their districts.
Wow, that's impressive. That's a lot.
So let's get into the wins and the challenges. What are the wins and what are still the ongoing challenges?
One thing to frame that question that I think is helpful, like I was talking about last question, legislative policy work is really the long game. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And the average number of sessions, I had a policy mentor tell me one time that it takes for a bill to become policy and become law is 3 sessions. So a lot of times our policy wins, one session becomes a policy challenge the next session because we need to build on that and expand it. And often we might be aiming for something and we are able to get, a portion of it or a smaller version of it. And so Stephanie's going to share a great example of that for us.
Yeah, like Anna said, it can definitely take a few sessions to get a really good bill passed. One bill I worked on last session was a suicide prevention bill specifically for kids in care, requiring the department to report on the number of suicide attempts of kids in care to kind of identify ways that we can help reduce suicide attempts by children in foster care. I don't think it's a secret that mental health is a huge issue in the state of Texas, not just among kids in foster care, but just kids in general. And that's something that we really wanted to prioritize, but it took 2 sessions to pass. One kind of win, but also challenge that we had last session, because it was like a small win. So we felt excited, but it was such a small win that we were like, I would have loved for it to have been a bigger one, was a tuition and fee waiver bill that we worked on. So if you're not familiar, any child that has been in foster care is entitled to a tuition and fee waiver, higher education. So for any public university in the state of Texas, they are entitled to a waiver that covers tuition and fees. The downside of this is it doesn't cover housing, kind of transportation or food, but tuition and fees can be really expensive, especially when you're a young adult aging out of care or having experienced foster care and you don't necessarily have the same support of someone who has a family that's driving them to orientation for college or buying their textbooks or paying their rent. A huge gap that we've noticed is for the tuition and fee waiver in the state of Texas, specifically for young adults who've aged out of care, they have a limit to that tuition and fee waiver. So up until last year, it was capped at 25. So young adults had until the age of 25 to utilize that tuition and fee waiver, or else they could not utilize it. Last session, we had drafted a bill to be a lifetime benefit so that that population could be able to utilize that tuition and fee waiver either at 24 or at 40 or any age. It's a pretty small population of people who would benefit from it, since I don't know really anyone who past their 20s is jumping at the bit to go back to college. But we were only able to get that waiver extended from 25 to 27. So super small win, but it still felt like a slight win. And that's something that I personally look forward to seeing come back next session. There was a lot of support for it. I think it's just an ongoing conversation, and one of those conversations of, working through bills and getting everyone on the same page. But it's a huge gap that we've noticed And we worked a lot with students who utilize the tuition and fee waiver, who have siblings that aren't able to utilize the waiver because they're too old. And it was a huge gap. And I've met students who are using it to go to medical school, which is incredible. But we already have such a small number of kids who have been in foster care. I believe only about 1.5% of people who have been in foster care have completed a bachelor's degree, which is an insane statistic considering the fact that the tuition and fee waiver exists. And so that's definitely been a focus of Texas CASA in the last session or two.
And this includes all degrees, right?
Yes.
Not just bachelor's or
Oh,
associates.
yes. Trade school, associate's degree, bachelor's degree. We've also worked a lot on building up preparation for adult living classes to educate young people who are getting ready to age out of foster care, so they're kind of aware you don't have to go to college if a 4-year degree doesn't feel like that's right for you. There's beauty school, there's trade school, there are a lot of opportunities for you, but this waiver is pretty flexible in the kind of education that it covers for this population.
That just blows my mind. And thank you for sharing that. And just to our listeners, remember, we did have an episode about higher education and students who were previously in foster care. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about that, to go check that episode out. If you're finding value in today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe to EduVoices, championing foster futures on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribing ensures you never miss an episode packed with powerful stories, expert insights, and actionable strategies for supporting children in foster care. Plus, it helps us continue growing this community of educators, advocates, and changemakers. Now let's get back to the conversation. How do education policies intersect with child welfare policies, and where do gaps still exist for foster-connected students?
I love this question because before my time at Texas CASA, I actually came from education policy. And it's been really encouraging to see how there's a lot of overlap in both of those worlds for advocating for all children in schools and advocating for children in care specifically. And so I'm excited to talk about this. One thing that we have really noticed in the intersection of both of those is what Stephanie talked about earlier with mental health. And so, mental health is something that impacts all kids, right? Especially kids in schools. I always like to say that kids spend most of their waking hours in school. So what happens at school really matters on their mental health. At the same time, children in care, though, are actually more disproportionately advantaged when it comes to accessing things like essential mental health support, especially in schools. This is exacerbated when you think about how often children in care are moving. So if you're moving from school to school, care that you might have access to in one county is not going to be the same care you're going to be able to access in another county. You have a new school counselor, right? You have a new community therapist, whatever it is that you're using to access care, that is all uprooted when you move. So one thing that's really important, and there's a bill that I was able to work on at my previous agency in Texas CASA, also worked on last session, which was giving students excused absences for mental health appointments. So this wasn't included before. If a student had a required mental health appointment, this wasn't an excused absence from school. Sometimes it was excused, but there was varying district to district and principal to principal. So that's a really exciting bill that will really support not just all kids in schools, but specifically these kids in care that really might experience exacerbated mental health needs and need support there. Mm-hmm. And Stephanie's going to talk about 2 other examples.
Yeah. So Anna talked a bit about how difficult it can be to access services, especially in schools when we're talking about kids in care constantly moving between placements. So on average, a child in care is going to have an average of about 3 placement changes during their time in care. However, I've heard instances of kids having anywhere from a dozen to 20 placement changes in the time they're in care, sometimes within like a really short period of time. And not only are they having a lot of placement changes, sometimes they're really, really far. We've heard stories from local CASA programs of kids being moved 600 miles away from home. We've had kids placed far out of state in Oregon or West Virginia, all over the country. And so it can be really, really difficult to keep kids connected and interacting and keep them on track in school. A placement change, just moving, if your family moves from one city to the next, is going to throw off your education. And so if we're thinking about a kid in care who's experiencing a significant amount of trauma from being removed from their home, then that's going to cause a lot of difficulty. And so one bill that we worked on last session that we were able to get passed, Senator West was a really great support on that one, it was a bill that helped establish residency for children, specifically who are placed with kinship caregivers, because kinship placements can be a little bit more difficult when establishing residency because it's a little bit of a unique placement for a child. And so that bill really helped us be able to have it codified that when children are with kinship placements, they're able to utilize that address to get registered for school, to at the very least get them to go to school, to have some normalcy in their life. Something we also talk about is the importance of normalcy for kids in care, and school is a huge part of that. Not only is education important, but seeing your friends, seeing your teachers, the social aspect of school, and making sure that kids in care have that opportunity to them. And in addition, a huge gap that I know we just talked about is higher education. We focus a lot on kids in care, but also former foster youth and making sure that they're still accessing the services that they're entitled to. There are a lot of former foster youth who choose to stay in something called extended foster care, which is available until the age of 21. Can stay in a supervised placement, usually something called supervised independent living, or SIL, since we love a good acronym in child welfare. And so something we've been doing is advocating for more SIL placements on college campuses or around community colleges, because not every college campus has a SIL placement. And so if I'm a former foster youth and I'm using my tuition and fee waiver, but I can't afford rent down in downtown Austin at UT, then what do I do? And so that's been a huge thing that we've been advocating for on top of our K through 12 kiddos.
How does data inform your policy decisions and advocacy strategies?
Yeah, our policy team is really big on data because we know that the legislature loves some good data. And so something that we keep rooted in our data and storytelling is the power of lived experience. And so something I work really hard on is anytime I'm testifying, meeting with a legislator, or training a local program on how to kind of share their story, is tying lived experience with a data point. Because it's really, really essential, especially when you're working with the legislature, to kind of pair that qualitative and quantitative data and storytelling. So for example, I mentioned earlier, I've worked with a local program who had a child that was placed 600 miles from home, and talking about how that CASA volunteer was having to travel back and forth those 600 miles one way to visit that child multiple times a month. And that child really, really benefited from that. We were able to get them the medication that they'd been resistant to until they had met their CASA volunteer. We were able to eventually get them moved to a placement closer to home because that CASA volunteer built up that really solid relationship with them. But when I talk about that story, I also talk about the fact that in fiscal year 25, around the CASA network in our 74 local programs, our programs traveled over 1 million miles to visit children. So it's not just like one or two instances of our volunteers having to go fly to go visit a child or go drive 600 miles to go visit a child. It's happening pretty consistently across the state. So when we're talking about any kind of local story or impact story, we always try to pair that with some kind of data to give that bigger picture. I find that legislators can get really hung up on the bigger picture. And so our job is to kind of fill in the local point of view of that, but also still tying it back to that bigger picture that they're used to.
So in that kind of situation, does that expense come out of the volunteer's pocket, or is there financial support for them to go and visit back and forth?
Yeah, it depends by program. That travel typically falls under the funding that we get from the Health and Human Services Commission, so travel reimbursement. But also something really cool that we've been able to provide to the network is Southwest Airlines has become a really incredible partner and has offered us flight vouchers. I think we usually get about 50 per year, so it's a little bit of a bid for local programs to get one of those vouchers, and we typically prioritize programs that have to fly the furthest, and those are the ones that get the vouchers first. So if you're having to fly to Washington, you get the voucher over someone that needs to fly from like Amarillo to Houston. And so that's been a great opportunity. But typically we do our best to reimburse volunteers for mileage. when we can. So consistently, that's what we see, but sometimes local programs can have trouble, reimbursements, especially in rural communities when we're having to travel a lot further.
Oh, shout out to Southwest.
Yeah, no, they've been the best. And they, I think, gave us a few more flight vouchers this last fiscal year because we told them, like, how successful the program was. They had no idea we had such a demand for it, and they were really touched that CASA has been so big on making sure we're keeping that connection because we want to make sure that kids are having that face-to-face time. It's not going to be the same if we're just having like a FaceTime or a Zoom call with a kiddo.
Yeah. Speaking of all stakeholders, what role can educators, school leaders, community members play in influencing foster care policy or supporting advocacy efforts?
Like I said earlier, kids spend most of their waking hours at school. So I think educators and school leaders are a huge part of this. And sometimes, as we know, educator can be the only safe person in a child's life, right? And in the child welfare space, this isn't just things like all educators being mandatory reporters, which means that if they see signs of abuse or neglect, they can call a hotline number, make sure kids are safe. That's so important. But deeper than that and even beyond that is just being a consistent person in that child's life who's really invested in their future. So I would just recommend, as an educator, school leader, even community member, pay attention to the children in your life and support that they need always. And you can be an advocate. We always like to talk about in CASA and with the network, we call our volunteer work advocacy work. It's not just advocacy at the Capitol, but you can really advocate for a kid and for their needs and just to help them thrive. And so if you're moved by these podcast stories, want to become a CASA volunteer yourself, you can always visit becomeacasa.org. If you're listening and you want to nerd out on policy like us, or if you have questions about that legislative process, want to be involved with us, you can also email the public policy team, publicpolicy@texascasa.org.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, we're always big on making legislative advocacy feel approachable and palatable. It can feel really scary for a lot of local programs that we work with. I used to work as a staffer at the Capitol before I came to CASA, and so I always try to like put things into perspective that I promise they're normal people. They go to the grocery store the same amount of times you do.
Yes.
They have kids, they have grandkids. Making a personal connection, super important. That's enough to get you through the door, but also everyone's a constituent at the end of the day.
Yes.
So you have just as much power in your words as the next person.
I was about to add, make sure you know who represents you at the Capitol and at the state and federal level. This is also plugged to pay attention to local politics. These are all people that are making decisions on your behalf and on behalf of children that you love. So pay attention to who represents you, and these are humans that you can reach out to and schedule a meeting with.
I think on that, teachers are just number one in this process. You think about the time, especially a kindergarten teacher, right? Someone that spends all day with the child.
Yeah.
And think about that foster child that's in the system and going through all these placements in different schools, but there's always that teacher. And then when the case closes,
yeah, who's going to be there
no more
after?
CASA, no more department, no more social workers, but the teacher now.
Yeah.
And I think that's just so powerful. And for them and to advocate for teachers
Oh, yeah.
on the importance of that is you are their lifeline.
Yeah. No, I'm huge on that. So, personal story, my stepmom is a teacher, and I wouldn't recommend every teacher do this, but she actually adopted 2 of her students. So I have 2 little sisters that were adopted 9 years ago this month because my stepmom was their teacher, and she noticed a lot of signs of abuse and neglect in their home and happened to become such a constant source of support for them that when they were removed, we ended up becoming their kinship placement and then eventually adopting them. And I think if she hadn't been there, it would have been a lot longer that they were languishing and not getting the support that they needed. And we actually just had their quinceañera last weekend, so they've been doing wonderful. But no, I've always been a big support because teachers are the ones that see the most. They see your kids every day, and They know your kids every day, and they notice a lot of stuff that even CASA isn't always able to notice.
So, looking ahead, what emerging policy conversations or reforms should listeners be paying attention to over the next few years?
I mean, how much time do you have?
I know, right?
Yeah, there's always stuff, but I think a huge thing that, interestingly enough, a lot of people don't know about is something called community-based care. So just for kind of a quick overview, community-based care is essentially the privatization of the child welfare system in the state of Texas. So this started about just over 10 years ago, and Texas is currently in the process of privatizing the child welfare system. So instead of having the Department of Family and Protective Services and CPS, Child Protective Services, like you traditionally think of foster care, the legislature wants foster care to be more community-based. So the idea of the concept is to have more services close to home, community members supporting kids in care, rather than having one agency in charge of the entire state, because Texas has one of the largest child welfare, the actual second largest population of kids in care in the entire country. And so community-based care, when we say privatizing, we're not talking about Amazon coming in and buying foster care. These are nonprofit child serving organizations that bid for contracts with the state to serve as the conservator for specific regions. There's 16 regions in the state of Texas and about 3 stages of rollout in each region. And we're only about, I would guesstimate, 70 to 80% rolled out across the state. But that has been a huge ongoing process. And it's been a huge learning process because, as we talked about, we're still not having the exact community-based care that we want. Kids aren't always being placed as close to home as we would love them to be. And especially in rural communities, there still isn't as much access or availability of mental health care services, parenting classes. Transportation is a consistent barrier for parents, especially, and guardians. And so a lot of what CASA has done over the last few years is really advocating for community-based care, supporting those contractors, but also advocating for more oversight and checks and balances. So I think something we can anticipate to see in the next legislative session is a lot of community-based care conversations, especially when we're talking about sunset review. Since sunset review, the magical time where we kind of review state agencies and how they're operating, it only happens once every 12 years. And currently the Department of Family and Protective Services and the Health and Human Services Commission are going through that delightful sunset review process. And so CASA has been a huge part of that, and community-based care has been at the forefront of that conversation that we've been having with the Sunset Commission of how can we improve it? How can we make it not just great on paper, but great in action for kids and families? Because on paper, it sounds really great to have foster care really centered. If I'm in the Panhandle and I have just one contractor that's their only job is to focus on foster care for that region, that's wonderful. And theoretically, we should have every child placed in the Panhandle. If I'm from Amarillo, I want my kid to stay in Amarillo. If I'm from Lubbock, I want my kid to stay in Lubbock. But that's not really what's happening in practice. And so I think that's going to be a big conversation in the next legislative session is how can we make it workable? How can we make it successful? CASA has been a huge advocate for that and supporting our contractors. But at the end of the day, we're always going to meet people where they're at. CASA has been big on adapting to these changes at the end of the day and making sure that regardless of what's happening at a statewide level, that no child or family is experiencing a gap.
As we conclude this session, anything y'all would like to add to provide to our listeners of EduVoices?
One thing that I would add is a huge way that we were able to get that tuition and fee waiver bill passed to kind of raise the age from 25 to 27 was because we had current college students utilizing the waiver testifying in committee and meeting with committee members. That was a huge push across the finish line. What I always tell local programs is, I can bring the data, but I can only bring so much. And so having that lived experience at the table is invaluable. And so I would even advocate for, if teachers have that knowledge or experience, bring it to the table. There's always going to be room for someone to pull up a seat at the table. You just have to be the one to ask for it.
Thank you both for helping us better understand how policy shapes practice.
And thank you to everyone who joined us for this special Texas CASA series. Across these conversations, we've explored leadership, relationships, systems, and policy, all essential to supporting foster-connected youth. Until next time, thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and thank you for championing foster futures.
Thank you for joining us on EduVoices, Champion Foster Futures. We hope today's episode sparked new insights and deepened your commitment to supporting foster youth. For updates, bonus content, and upcoming sessions, follow us on our social media outlets or visit our podcast page. But until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep advocating.